Okay, let's get started. We're going to go in this order: public debt, payments, civil divisions, state retirement, and supplemental. So, Mr. Treasurer, actually, Mr. Patrick, yes. Mr. Patrick, Mr. Frank.
Go ahead.
You can begin. Yep.
Okay, yeah, the first hearing today will be for the public debt. The public debt is what pays the debt service on the state's general obligation bonds. As you can see on the front page here, there is about a $1.4 billion appropriation proposed for the public debt in fiscal 2026. And that is slightly less than the previous year. The trend is for this to go up every year. We'll talk more about later about what the more recent trends are and why this will be going on. I'm going to skip to page 3 now. That provides a summary of all the different kinds of debt that the Treasurer issues, that is GO bonds. Some of these have not been issued. Some are being retired right now, and others are going strong. On page 4, in exhibit number 1, this provides a breakdown of the payment in fiscal 2026. As you can see from the red part of the pie, about 30% of the debt is interest, and the other 70% is principal. The reason for this fairly low ratio is that the state has only 15-year maturities on its bonds, and so we tend to retire debt much more quickly. If the state were to have, say, 30-year bonds instead of 15-year bonds, that ratio would be closer to 50-50, where half of the debt service payment on average would be for interest. There are some advantages to this, and most specifically, obviously, that you pay your debt down more quickly when you have the shorter maturities. On page 5 is a summary that shows what that $1.4 billion is of public debt. What you'll notice is you go down about 2/3 of the page, the subtotal is $1.4 billion. So 97.5% is our bonds that have already been issued. So even if we were to stop issuing bonds, that would be how much would be due in fiscal year 2026. What you see at the bottom there of that exhibit 2 is that about $40 million of additional debt is anticipated in fiscal year 2026 from the June 2025 bond sale. And I'm going to break down that number on page 6 in exhibit number 3. This is the new sale for June 2025. One thing that's going on is DBM and DLS have different estimates of the debt service, and I will explain why that is. There's really 2 parts to this. One is a new bond issuance. DBM expects about $69.5 million in debt service from that, DLS $42 million. The difference between the 2 estimates is that DBM used the fall estimate from 2024, which is $1.35 billion of bonds being issued. DLS is assuming $900 million, which is a more current estimate, and the estimate that the Treasurer's Office is using. So that's a $27.5 million difference between the 2 of them. The second has to do with the second part of the issuance, which is a refunding. The state issues bonds that are callable after 10 years, which means that if interest rates are lower, you can call the bonds back, retire them, and issue lower cost debt in its place. DBM, in this case, for both parties, are assuming about assuming the same amount of par value. The difference, though, is that and there'll be a more detailed discussion later, is that DBM is taking it all out in the first year, whereas DLS is spreading it out over 6 years. So they have a $30 million reduction because of that in 26, and we have $5 million, but that's spread over the forecast period. On page 7, Exhibit 4, this is the annuity bond forecast, or the bond fund forecast, and this is what pays for state debt. As you can see, the largest number in the revenue side is $1.114 billion of state property taxes. That's about 78% of the debt service cost. The remaining funds are provided by the general fund, a little bit of federal funds, and also some premiums from prior years. I should point out also that the forecast in the out years has a $10 million fund balance. And I just want to also say a comment about the debt service going down about $60 million from fiscal year 25 to 26 is pretty unusual. There's a couple of reasons for it. One reason is that there were some very large issuances in 2010 that 15 years later are maturing, and so they're coming off the books. The second reason will be discussed more in issue number 4, and that has to do with our issuances seeming to be slowing in the last few years. Since the state property tax is what pays for the most of the debt service, we take a good look at this number to see what anticipate whether we're going to have enough to pay for that. And the two things that we pay attention to in Exhibit 5 has to do with the median home prices and the active inventory. As you can see from the red line, the median sales price has been climbing steadily, which I think everybody probably would have guessed that, considering what's happening in home prices. The other trend, as you probably would have guessed as well, is the dotted line, and that shows that inventories are down in recent years. Page 9, Exhibit 6, compares the homestead tax credit and the tax revenue per penny. And the homestead tax credit, that's a limit on the amount that a person's annual property tax can increase if the state limits it to 10%. And you can see, as it probably would have guessed it, that during the run-up to the Great Recession, there was a great increase in property homestead tax credits. The reason for that is that the home values were outpacing that 10% ceiling, and so instead of paying extra, the additional credits went into the homestead tax credits. This number is much lower now. It has been increasing in recent years, which is indicative of the recent increases in home values, but it doesn't compare at all to the sharp increases that we saw 15 years ago. And also, as we can see, as you would have guessed, the price of what every penny of sales tax gets has been increasing steadily too as home values have increased. Page 10 has exhibit number 7, and what that shows is the debt service and the state property tax estimates for the out years. And as you can see from it, the debt service is expected to grow faster than state property taxes, which suggests that general fund appropriations in the out years are going to be increasing steadily. It's about 78% in 2026 and down to 70% in 2030. And that is the end of my review of the fund and that pays for the debt service. And I'm going to cover 4 issues quickly. The first has to do with the negative outlook that Moody's assigned GO bonds at the last sale in June of 2024. The first thing I'll say about it is that Moody's has been changing and how they evaluate debt to be more quantitative, so they're paying more attention to numbers and ratios and things like that. Second thing is, I haven't noticed a very big effect in the interest rates after the sale that they went up. You would expect some increase, but it's hard to say exactly what it is. But I do note that this happened once before in July of 2011, and at that time it seemed like about a 23 basis points or 0.23% was what the rate jumped at that time. And so that was a very stark event. This one seems to be less so. Second point I'd like to make starts on page 11 and really is best shown on page 12 in exhibit number 8. And here what this is about is Maryland's liabilities. And Maryland is a high debt state. We have lots of high liabilities. And what this exhibit shows on the left are the states that have AAA ratings from all 3 rating agencies. And the numbers in the exhibit are the national ranking. In this case, the higher your number, the higher your liability. So if you're number 1, that means you have the highest liability. I've highlighted Maryland in all of these exhibits, and I've also highlighted the states that have a higher, of the AAA rated states, I should say, that have a higher ranking than Maryland. So in all of these, just about all these ratios, Maryland is the highest, and some it's second highest. Now, Moody's did make a couple of adjustments to these things. I'll mention a few of them. First of all, one difference between the way Moody's counts debt and we do is they consider all lottery debt to be state debt, but we do not. So that affects these numbers by increasing it. A second thing that they do is they normalize the interest rates so that they're about maturity period really is what we're talking about. So the issue is as I mentioned earlier, Maryland issues 15-year debt, which makes it a little more expensive in the short term, but it means you retire your debt quicker. And so, but other states issue 30-year debt. So if you compare the two, it's not really a fair comparison to say, well, Maryland and penalize Maryland for higher debt service payments when we're doing it prudently. So the idea of normalizing is everybody is measured as if they were selling 20-year debt, so that it's an apples-to-apples comparison between all the different states. And so to try to get the comparisons more even, they do that. And finally, with regard to pension liabilities, they use the same discount rate or assumed return for all of the funds, and that's a similar situation as with the maturity of your bonds, in that if you have, say, if you assume a higher return, then it makes your portfolio look better than if it were, or at least have lower liabilities than otherwise. And so these are some attempts were made by Moody's to get the data so it could be compared more consistently. What I also on page 13, I want to point out is with regards to the high debt, and that is that the Stadium Authority has had a lot of new issuances since calendar 2019. And these authorizations are shown on pages 13 and 14. I won't go over through them in the interest of time. Also, I will say this is another difference between Maryland and the rating agencies, and you can see it on Exhibit 9, page 15, is that like I said earlier, with lottery debt, what's counted is counted differently depending on which rating agency it is. But the one thing that's consistent about all of them is that they all do count more debt than Maryland counts in its numbers. So there is no one formula for all of this, but the formulas tend to be higher than Maryland. And so basically about the whole rating, what's a prudent way to address it? And we have 3 bullets over here on page 16. The first is the Spending Affordability Committee goals of eliminating the 26 structural deficit. We think that's a good way to do that, because one of the concerns that Moody's has is that our structural deficit has become large, and that's one of the reasons they put us on watch. Avoid issuing new large capital commitments, and also maybe looking again at how we rate debt and what we consider to be state debt to align it possibly more closely with the rating agencies. I'll also comment that kind of a green eye shades issue. When I said earlier about the free funding opportunities, the reason we can do that is because we issue callable bonds. Callable bonds after 10 years, which means that after 10 years we can retire bonds early. We pay extra for that, and DLS's concern is that it seems we're paying quite a bit for it, and we don't want to overpay for that. So we want to ask that the Treasurer's Office look at those numbers very carefully, so that we don't overpay for as much as the call benefit is. If you overpay for it, then you don't really get the benefit you think you're getting. So that should be watched closely. Second issue is the bond outlook for the June sale. I'll start with an exhibit on page 18. It's exhibit number 10. And this shows long-term, these are the 10-year Treasury notes. The reason I chose them is because the average maturity of a Maryland bond is 10 years, so it tracks nicely with our bonds. As you can see from the blue line is what the rate has been since January 1962, and the red line is what the rate was on January 16th when I collected the data for this. And basically, the rate on that day was lower than 63% of the time over the last 60-some years. So our rates, in a comparative sense, are high when we consider the period since the Great Recession and certainly during the pandemic. But our rates right now are pretty comparable. If you're living in 2006, and these are the rates we had then, and they were at the time lower than they had been in the past. So how we feel about interest rates sometimes is affected very much by our recent experiences. But the good news is in a comparative sense, the rates are still low, and that is very helpful for our capital program. On page 19 is exhibit number 11, and that shows recent experience, and I use a couple of different indicators there. The blue one is indicator for 10-year Treasury notes. The yellow one is the bond buyer 20 index. That's state and municipal bonds. In this case, what's good about it, you can see that Maryland, because it's high-rated bonds, what we pay is less generally than those indices are. You can also see the upward trend in recent years. The red line, that's the coupon rate, or 5%, that we're offering on our bonds. So, and that's also the out-year estimate of debt service costs. So if we go above that 5%, then that would result in higher debt service costs in the out years. So it doesn't seem like we're going to go above 5%. With the on page 20, I talk a little bit about the upcoming sale issue. I guess the main issue I want to talk about is that the refunding bonds. Basically, if you go to page 21, Exhibit 12 shows you 3 different ways of I guess applying the savings from the refunding bonds. The first is what's commonly done. It's called level savings. You just pretty much take the same amount out of each year. That gives you the most total savings, also the highest present value savings. A second approach is what's called upfront savings, and we did this in June, July, I think it was maybe in July of 2020. At the time, this was during the pandemic. There were serious concerns about cash, and there was a great refunding opportunity with the low interest rates. So at the time, the decision was made to just maximize cash now, which was probably a good idea. It was one of those funny things. It was a good idea at the time, but in retrospect, the crash crunch never really happened. But so the upfront savings, and there's the others, deferred amortization, and that means you take even more upfront. This has never been done before, and I think this is probably more of a kind of a sense of curiosity why that would be, and just kind of intellectual curiosity maybe to see what that would look like. But as far as the most common ones, it would be those 2. State tends to do level savings. We would recommend that. First of all, most of savings. Second of all, you get a structural benefit for the full 6 years, and since it's a multi-year problem, we recommend a multi-year solution. It also minimizes risk. If your refunding isn't as much as you think it's going to be, then you take it out of 6 years. So if it's half as much, it's only a few million a year instead of 15 million taken out of the first year. And also, there is a $10 million balance in the fund, so even if there's no savings, you still don't have to. You won't run out of cash in 2026. A third issue has to do with the number of bond sales that the state has. That is, on page 22 shows that well. Basically, in the past, it's always been about two sales a year, sometimes 3. Occasionally, there was the one in 2016 when there was a switch in financial advisors, but in recent years, it's been only 1 sale a year. We recommend that the state go back to the 2 sales a year. The reasons are on page 23. First of all, if you look at sale size, it's kind of U-shaped. Smaller sales tend to have higher interest cost. There's more transaction cost that has to go over a smaller amount of bonds being sold. As that increases, costs tend to go down. At the other end, what happens is when issuance is larger and larger, there's issue with marketability and less bidders and less people can actually bid on it, and you have consortia and things like that. And so there's a sweet spot in the middle. We're concerned that if the state just does one very large bond sale each year, you're moving out of the sweet spot. And so that's the first reason. The second reason is one a year is kind of risky. And I'll give you a couple of examples. In March 2020, we did a bond sale. It was crazy low rates. We're really lucky. It's, some smart person picked the perfect day. July 2011, it was right before there was just talk in Washington about defaulting on the state debt. State gets a negative rating right before the bond sale, with a few other states also. It really had a bad effect. That was a poor choice for doing the sale there. But the issue about sales, though, is the decision is made many months ahead of time, and the individual circumstances, like what's going on in Washington or what's going on in world health or whatever issues, you really can't control them. So having 2 sales spreads your risk a little more, so you're less likely to be really caught at a bad time to do a sale. And also another issue with the March sale, soon after that, markets went crazy, and the state probably wouldn't have been wise to sell at all until markets calm down. And especially if you do it too late in the year, if something really crazy happens and you want to defer your sale, do you want to defer into the next fiscal year is another question you want to ask yourself. And so we think that spreading the risk is a good idea. And finally, one of the issues like with this year is there's a lot of uncertainty about what the debt service number is going to be. And if there had been more sales and we had already had the sales, then there wouldn't be this uncertainty. And so having more sales sooner reduces the uncertainty in the budget and makes your work easier. And so we're recommending a narrative to go back to 2. Final issue here has to do with the thing I mentioned earlier about less issuances lately. If you go to page 25 on Exhibit 14, what that shows is how the issuances have kind of slowed a little bit, and that the authorized but unissued debt has increased quite a bit. What I'm talking about here is when you authorize GO bonds, what you're doing is you're giving the State Treasurer's Office the right to go ahead and sell bonds at the appropriate time. And as you know, capital projects take years. And so if it takes a few years until the funds are needed for a construction project, the Treasurer delays issuing those bonds. And so because there's a couple of reasons. One is arbitrage. There's federal penalties if you issue and sit on too much cash. And the other thing is you want to pay vendors on time, so you don't want to do it too late. So it's a kind of a tricky game as to when you issue that. And so what kind of we're saying here is that these numbers are getting out of whack, and we're collecting a lot of debt, or unissued bonds are out there that it is increasing too much. And we should look at the ratios that we're using to try to forecast this a little bit better. And there's been a lot of factors like with the pandemic and supply chain and all these other kinds of issues. And maybe the world is a little different, and the way we did it 30 years ago isn't relevant anymore. And so we're recommending some narrative to examine that issue. And I'll conclude on page 26 are my 3 recommendations, which I've already mentioned: the reduction in the debt service, the multiple bond sales per year, and the reevaluation of our issuance policies. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks and take questions.
Thank you very much. Questions for our analyst? Thank you very much. Mr. Treasurer.
I think we were confusing which hearing we were having at the moment, but I see they got it straight now. First of all, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I certainly appreciate you all taking the time out to have us before you here today. To my immediate right is Ms. Rebecca Ruff, Director of Debt Management, and to her right is Mr. Jonathan Martin, Chief Deputy Treasurer in the Office of State Treasurer, who's celebrating a milestone birthday today with us. So thank you for having us. I tried not to put him all the way out there. Let me start by giving a special note of thanks to Mr. Patrick Frank with the Department of Legislative Services. Always does a thoughtful analysis, and we appreciate his perspective on the state's debt. In the interest of time, you all have my fuller written testimony, so I'm going to try to keep my comments brief. The bottom line is that I would ask the committee, with a few notable exceptions, to concur with the DLS recommendations for the proposed public debt budget for fiscal year 2026. This past June, my office successfully helped the state issue over $1 billion in general obligation bonds. We received interest from a combined 8 major banks, achieving favorable pricing with an all-in true interest cost of 3.37%, and earned over $150 million in premium to support the capital program. Prior to the sale, we hosted analysts from the 3 major rating agencies for in-person visits to Maryland for the first time in over a decade. The collaborative effort among the state's fiscal leaders, including President Ferguson and Chair Gazone, in the wake of the Key Bridge collapse helped secure a continued AAA rating from all three rating agencies. Moody's, however, did assign the state a negative outlook. It is no secret that all three rating agencies have been monitoring Maryland's credit more closely as our fiscal outlook has evolved and their own internal rating criterion, as mentioned earlier, has changed as well. The concerns raised by the rating agencies, a high debt burden, close nexus to the federal government, and sizable structural budget gap are serious and require some responsive action from the state to continue to protect our highly regarded rating. My office maintains regular communications with the state's assigned rating analysts, share the plethora of fiscal information that Maryland is well known for producing. We look forward to collaborating with the General Assembly and the governor as the state moves through the budget process and crafts a plan that continues to uphold the quality of Maryland's credit. In terms of departures from DLS recommendations, I have but two. First, in recommendation number 1, DLS estimates a fiscal 2026 debt service appropriation that varies from the assumptions in the governor's allowance. At a time when markets are particularly volatile, I request that you also provide access to supplemental funding from the rainy day fund in case it is needed to backfill the appropriation. This would only be needed if the final sale outcome varies from the expectations, but it is a prudent step to take in these uncertain economic times. Second, recommendation number 2 requests that my office returns to the policy of having multiple annual bond sales if total issuances exceeds $700 million. There are a range of factors to take into consideration when structuring a bond sale, including cost efficiency, financing, feedback from the rating agencies, and capital spending demands. It is difficult to predict the necessary structure and outcome from a sale that is scheduled for several months from now. The most beneficial support I can receive from you is the ability to be flexible and responsible in structuring our issuing plans. I pledge to keep the General Assembly and the administration informed as we move forward through the planning process and assumptions evolve. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the public debt budget with you today. With these two departures from the DLS recommendations, I would ask you to concur with the DLS recommendations. Together, we continue to do what is necessary to uphold Maryland's high-quality credit and ensure adequate funding for the state's debt service obligations.
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer. Questions from the committee? Look at that. Happy birthday.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Okay. Payments to civil divisions. Welcome. Begin whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and the members of the committee. I am Yashoda Rai, and I'll be presenting the fiscal 26 budget analysis for payments to civil divisions of the state. This portion of the budget is comprised of 3 items: disparity grants to low-wealth jurisdictions based on a formula set in statute, grants to mitigate the impact of the local assumption of a portion of teacher retirement costs. These amounts are set in statute, and gaming grants to Calvert County. As shown here on page 1, the fiscal 26 budget decreases by $25.8 million after accounting for a contingent reduction in the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, BRFA, of 2025 as introduced, which we will discuss later in the analysis. On page 2, Exhibit 1 shows each county's various grant amounts in fiscal 26 allowance after accounting for the contingent reduction. The second column lists the disparity grant amount that each county receives, and the third column is the amount provided to local school boards to supplement their assumption of a portion of teacher retirement costs. On page 3, Exhibit 2 shows that general fund in fiscal 26 declines by $25.8 million. Of these, $11.9 million is attributable to the net decrease in disparity grants. Counties receiving an increase in fiscal 26 disparity grant amounts are Somerset, Washington, and Wicomico, while the grant amount decreases for Caroline, Dorchester, Garrett, and Prince George's counties. The remaining decrease of $13.8 million is attributable to the reduction in the mandated appropriation for the teacher retirement supplemental grants, which is contingent on enactment of the BRFA. Page 4 highlights the proposed BRFA provision as introduced. Exhibit 3 shows that this BRFA provision reduces the teacher retirement supplemental grant mandated appropriation from $27.7 million to $13.8 million in fiscal 26. Also, another BRFA provision repeals the mandated appropriation to this grant starting fiscal 27. This grant was established in fiscal 2013 to offset costs related to teacher pension shifting to local jurisdictions and to assist local jurisdictions with the transition. According to the Department of Budget and Management, local jurisdictions have had sufficient time to make accommodations for this cost over the years, and the grants phase out takes into consideration the local jurisdictions' need to plan for these costs. Page 5 provides a brief background on the disparity grants, which are state funding targeted at the difference in counties' abilities in raising revenue from their local income tax. Counties with per capita local tax revenues less than 75% of the statewide per capita local tax revenue are eligible for grants in the amount of the difference between their revenue and 75% of the statewide average. There is a soft cap on the grant based on the county's 2010 grant amount and the county's tax rate. On page 6, Exhibit 4 shows the disparity grant calculation under current law for fiscal 26. The total fiscal 26 grant amount lowers to approximately $177 million from $188 million in fiscal 25. The tax rates for Anne Arundel County and Frederick County are noted various because they adopted graduated income tax brackets starting tax year 2023. Details on the graduated income tax brackets for these counties can be found in Appendix 2 on pages 10 and 11. Page 7 describes the adoption of the graduated income tax brackets that were established by Chapter 23 of the 2021 special session. The legislation requires all local governments to impose a minimum tax rate of 2.25% and a maximum rate of 3.2%. It also authorizes local governments to impose graduated county income tax. In the 2024 JCR, the committees requested a report from DBM and the Office of the Comptroller on how the minimum state grant would be calculated for jurisdictions with graduated income tax rates. The agencies proposed using an effective gross tax rate, which is calculated by dividing the income tax revenues by pre-tax earnings, and noted that the effective gross tax rate would be reported in the annual income tax summary report beginning tax year 2023. The effective gross tax rates for Anne Arundel and Frederick counties for tax year 2023 are 2.76% and 2.9% respectively. The agencies also noted that no change to statute is required currently. On page 8 is DLS's recommendation to concur with the governor's allowance. Pages 9 to 13 are appendices. This is the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Any questions for the analyst? Seeing none, thank you very much. We'll now call up the Department of Budget and Management, Secretary Grady.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Vice Chair, and members of the committee. My name is Helene Grady, Secretary of Budget and Management, and I'm joined here this afternoon by Nathan Bowen, who is the Executive Director of our Office of Budget Analysis. Normally, Mark Nicole, our Deputy Secretary, would join as well, but Mark is out of town on a family matter today. We very much appreciate the analysis by our DLS analyst on payments to civil divisions. DLS did not have any questions or recommendations for us to respond to, so we've kept our testimony very brief and short, but we're happy to talk through any questions that might be on your mind today.
Any questions for the Secretary? Thank you very much, Madam Secretary.
Sure, thank you.
We'll now go to the State Retirement Agency. Call up Jacob Cash for the analysis. Welcome.
Thank you. As you said, my name is Jacob Cash. I'll be presenting the budget analysis for the State Retirement Agency, or SRA. SRA, at the direction of the Board of Trustees, has primary responsibility over the state's retirement systems. The fiscal 2026 allowance is $64.1 million, or an increase of $4.6 million from fiscal 2025. The agency is funded through an administrative charge on all employers for who the agency administers retirement benefits. State agencies account for roughly 1/3 of SRA's funding, while local school boards and governmental units make up the rest of the budget funding. You'll notice that the fund split in the allowance reflects the share of state to local employees in the system, with reimbursable funds approximately half the size of special funds. The investment division is non-budgeted, and that makes up 40% of the allowance. Moving to Exhibit 1 on page 4. This shows the membership in the state's retirement system by active employees and retirees. For the second time since 2010, the number of active members grew by more than the number of retirees. Moving to Exhibit 3 on page 6. This exhibit shows SRA's call center wait times. The agency has struggled for several years to meet wait time and dropped call goals. In calendar 2024, wait times grew to an average of 5.5 minutes. SRA attributes the issue primarily to the agency's difficulty in filling vacant positions and slightly above average call volumes. Moving to Exhibit 5 on page 8. This compares the fiscal 2025 budget to fiscal 2024. Within the administration division, cost increases are due primarily to statewide cost of living increases. Other large changes are due to retaining senior IT consultants for ongoing system modernization and the end of funding for one-time database server replacements, which balances out that IT spending. Moving to page 9, this shows personnel for the agency. SRA adds 4 new positions, including a Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Governance as required by Chapter 495 of 2024. SRA is also developing in-house human resources, which have previously been provided by DBM. And related to this change, 2 positions are added, and the budget for shared HR services decreases. This change is cost neutral. In addition, 4 positions are converted from contractual positions, adding a net of $112,000. SRA vacancies have declined over the past year, but they do remain elevated compared to the budgeted turnover, and so there is room in their budget to reduce vacancies further by 7 positions. To Exhibit 6 on page 11, this first issue is about the system's performance. Exhibit 6 shows the state's investment performance in fiscal 2024 by asset allocation. Total fund performance was 6.93%, and system assets totaled $68.2 billion at the close of the year, representing growth of $3 billion. Exhibit 8 compares the system to its benchmarks. Overall, the system beat benchmarks by 0.59%, indicating that the system's use of active management is yielding returns above what could be achieved through a passive or indexed approach. Now moving to page 16, Exhibit 10 shows the system's funding levels since 2006. The system closed fiscal 2024 with a 72.9% funded ratio, which is the second year-over-year decline in the funded ratio since reforms. To issue number 2 on page 16, the budget as introduced proposes to eliminate 2 supplemental appropriations to the budget, to the pension system. The first is a $50 million supplemental contribution meant to increase the funded ratio of assets to liabilities, which we just discussed has been decreasing the past 2 years. And the second is a $25 million supplemental contribution called the sweeper provision, which is sourced from the general fund's unexpended balance. The provisions are both eliminated under the current budget plan, and funding is removed. There will be more discussion of the sweeper provisions in the state reserve fund analysis, where those funds are actually budgeted. Now moving to page 17, issue number 3 discusses consensus legislation proposed by SRA with collaboration from DBM and DLS. This would change how administrative fees are budgeted. Administrative fees are currently budgeted in every state agency for their share of costs, and those costs are to be remitted to SRA separately from their retirement contributions. However, this legislation would instead add the cost of administration to the retirement contributions each year and pay administrative expenses for SRA directly through the pension trust fund. This simplifies the administrative process for SRA and the budgeting of fees for client agencies. With this change, the budget as introduced includes a fee holiday on payments in 2026, generating savings of $5.7 million in general funds that will be replaced with non-budgeted funds from the pension trust fund. Next, on page 18, Exhibit 11 shows a proposed reduction in the budget for the local teacher retirement grant. Current law requires the state to subsidize a share of the employer contribution for local employees who are in the teachers' retirement systems. The BRFA proposes to permanently lower the state subsidy by $97.7 million in fiscal 2026 and each year thereafter. Exhibit 11 shows the cost shift in relation to the overall amount provided by the state that the locals will see. In conclusion, DLS recommends concurring with the governor's allowance, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Questions for our analysts?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question about the BRFA provisions, and also I'm looking at the BRFA provisions that were in the payments to civil divisions. So if I understand correctly, the governor, through the BRFA, has cost containment for the teacher's retirement, shifting it to locals, and the teacher's retirement supplemental grant, both? Is that correct? I know this is not in your wheel.
So I think just that $97.7 million will be shifted to the locals, from what I understand. The other supplemental contributions were for increasing the fund balance, essentially.
Okay. This says the grant was established to offset costs associated with teacher pension shifting to local jurisdictions.
So that was removed last year in the BRFA. That the $50 million supplemental contribution I discussed was part of a larger $75 million one. So that was reduced from $75 to $50 million last year because this provision of law, which reduced the state share to the locals, they got rid of that provision. So that extra $25 million in the supplemental was no longer needed. So they reduced that to $50 million. Now we're taking that $50 million down to zero.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions? Okay, thank you. Director Noden? Oh, we have the treasurer first. Okay, together. It's not on my list. I read what's on my list.
I know the feeling. Good afternoon once again, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the committee. I'm going to try what Secretary Grady did, and I'm going to be real brief, and we'll see how this goes. As you all know, sitting next to me to my immediate right is Mr. Martin Noven, the Executive Director of the Maryland State Retirement Agency, who has brought senior staff to join him today. Let me first of all thank Mr. Jacob Cash for his thorough analysis and the time he's taken in his first year as the agency's analyst to understand the agency and the complex system. I'd also like to commend Mr. Philip Anthony for his insightfulness and firm grasp of pension legislation beyond the scope of this budget hearing. I believe Philip has staffed the subcommittee for about 15 years now, and I want to be sure he received some well-earned recognition. Having served as chair of the system of the Board of Trustees for over 3 years, I've had the privilege to witness a lot of improvement and positive change, both at the agency and with the pension system. Last year, the board welcomed 2 new members, 2 new trustees. They have brought with them excellent oversight and a fresh perspective to both the benefits and investments side of the system. At last month's board meeting, the system's chief investment officer, Mr. Andrew Palmer, announced his retirement. He has served as CIO in Maryland since July of 2015, close to a decade now, and he will continue to serve as CIO while the board and the Maryland State Retirement Agency conduct a global search for his successor. Andy is slated to step down on June 30th and is working closely with me, the executive director, and our trustees to ensure a smooth transition. Andy is here with us today, and on a personal note, I'd like to commend him for serving the people of Maryland for the last 10 years. Through his leadership, he has built a well-funded portfolio and paved the way for a more inclusive and prosperous future. So thank you, Andy. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to the system's executive director, Mr. Martin Oven.
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer. Good afternoon, Chairman Guzzoni, Vice Chair Rosapet, members of the committee. Thank you for giving me a minute to speak. I, too, am going to be brief, following the lead of 2 of my trustees on the board. We very much appreciate that the proposed budget fully funds the system. I understand some of the sweeper funds and some of the extra funding was removed, but from our standpoint, it's essential that all of our funding is provided to us every year, and our core funding is all being provided this year, and that's it hasn't gone unnoticed. We understand that when budget times get tight, it makes it harder and harder to make those payments. So I want to just say that we're so pleased that the budget has those payments. You know, I come from Illinois, as you may remember, and we had a number of years of pension holidays where payments weren't made, and that was a deep hole they're still trying to dig out from under. They are still not even 50% funded. You know, we here in Maryland are 72.9% funded. We remain on track to be fully funded by 2039, and that doesn't come without you know, some discipline and making some tough choices. So we understand this was another year of tough choices, and we appreciate it. We also appreciate that the budget that's been proposed provides us the resources we need to fully serve our members. Last year, you gave us a position to create a member benefits group. That's a standalone group that would focus more on serving our members' needs, which was essential. I'm happy to say we have hired a member benefits administrator. He's here today. He's actually sitting behind me, Gary Burgess, and he's got a lot of great ideas, and we're excited to, you know, he's still new, but already hit the ground running. We appreciate that we didn't make the call center, our call times this year, the 5.5 minutes or 5.5 minutes versus the 3 minutes was due to staffing, understaffing, but we do need to do better. And so we're looking at different kinds of creative solutions to bring other staff in when we have staff shortages, so we can still try to provide a good, consistent, and high-level service to our members. I will mention, though, it's not necessarily as relevant, but since July 1 of this year, we've done better than three minutes for our call wait times. We're actually at 2 minutes, 38 seconds since that time, but that's mostly related to staffing. So the real test is going to be, can we build a system that works even when we're having some hiring challenges like we've had in the recent years? And I think we'll get there. But even more important is we're going to be focusing on proactively reaching out to our members and educating our members and making sure they know where they are in terms of their retirement benefits and make sure they know where to get the tools they need to retire with dignity. And that really is our push, and we're hoping with this new structure and this new unit we'll be able to fulfill that mission even better. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. We have a number of staff members, senior staff members, who can also answer any questions. I definitely would like to invite Andy Palmer up here for his last chance to answer questions at a committee such as this, in case you have any questions for him or in case he wants to say a word or two.
Do them just like the new guys, you know, when the new legislators, you all ask them questions on their first bill.
You made a reference a few minutes ago to the funding ratio, which looked like it was steadily increasing since 2011, but in the last couple of years, since 2021, it actually declined by about 3.5 percentage points. What does that due to?
Well, it's due to a few different factors. So, this year we have a decline because interest rates cause salaries to go up and COLAs to go up. We also have smoothing in terms of investment returns. So while we beat our assumed rate of return this year, we're still averaging some years that were tough years. In those tough years, we're pretty proud that we only lost 3%, while other comparable systems lost 13%, but it's still a loss. It still hits our bottom line. So it's like, you always see those charts on, social media about how the road to success isn't like this, it's bumpy, and so is our road to success. But we're on path, and we're actually in very good shape relative to our peer funds as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two quick questions. One is, I noticed you still have a vacancy on your board, so just if you could give us a status of filling that. And two is, have you considered, you talked about creative solutions to responding to your call time waits. Have you considered AI or using any kind of virtual assistance in helping you there?
Absolutely. So I'll answer your second question first. We are looking at those types of solutions, even a simple virtual chat function with a live person behind it where people can get a quick answer to their questions, and the person doing the chat work can help 2 or 3 people at the same time. So even some of the more rudimentary things that have been around for 20 years, it is way past time for us to start implementing those types of things. We do know we have a lot of elderly people who really need to talk to someone, whether it's in person or on the phone. The problem is if we don't clear out the queue of the people who don't need that service, we're not going to be able to get to them quickly enough. So it's definitely a top priority. Now I forgot your first question.
The vacancy on the board.
Yeah, we have spoken to the governor's appointments office. That vacancy is a harder one to fill because it has to be someone from a participating governmental unit. So we seem to get, when we're looking for appointments and we're asking the governor's office where they are, we tend to get the investment professionals who are knocking on their door and who are easier to identify. They seem to be appointed first, but we do hope that we'll be fully staffed soon.
Thank you.
Any questions? Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
You too. Supplemental retirement, Mr. Cash.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Maryland Supplemental Retirement Plans, or MSRP, provides employees with 4 supplemental retirement plan options and funds its operations with a fee on member accounts. MSRP's fiscal 2026 allowance of $2.7 million in special funds is a 9% increase from fiscal 2025, entirely due to an increase in statewide shared services allocation, which supports MSRP human resources, IT, and other administrative functions. Moving to Exhibit 1 on page 2, this shows agency spending in fiscal 2026 allowance. As you can see, almost 3/4 of spending is for personnel, with most other costs for shared services and contracts. Exhibit 3 on page, excuse me. The first issue begins on page 4. Chapter 100 of 2023 reestablished the state match program of up to $600 for state employees participating in a supplemental retirement plan. About $12 million in centralized funding has been budgeted in the DBM statewide expenses account for each year since the match was implemented. However, the current budget plan eliminates these centralized funds and requires that agencies instead find money elsewhere in their budgets to pay for these matches. To be clear, the match is still being offered and is still being paid out. DLS expects most of the agencies to pay for the match with vacancy savings, fund balance, and other savings generated during the fiscal year. Moving to Exhibit 3 on page 5. The match has driven growth in the program, as shown in Exhibit 3, with 9% growth in the number of contributing members in fiscal 2023. While similar growth was predicted in fiscal 2024, MSRP only saw a 2% increase. High growth is predicted in fiscal 2024 and 2025, 2025 and 2026, related to the match, but more specifically related to a departmental bill to automatically enroll all new state employees and provide an opt-out process. DLS is asking MSRP to comment on how much enrollment is expected to grow in fiscal 2025 and 2026 if this bill does not pass. To page 6, Exhibit 4 shows the plan expenses and revenues. Participant fees are 50 cents per month and 0.11% of assets. The closing balance in fiscal 2024 was 18% of expenses, while the closing balance in fiscal 2025 is expected to be 35.8% of expenses. And this is above MSRP's target goal of 25%. On page 7, you can see the plan's performance against benchmarks. MSRP plan options gained 16.2% in fiscal 2024, slightly better than their benchmarks. DLS is asking MSRP to comment on the plan's recent performance compared to fiscal 2023, when performance lagged the benchmarks. In conclusion, DLS recommends concurring with the governor's allowance, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Yeah.
This might be better, and tell me if it's better for the agency, but in terms of the contract with Nationwide Retirement and their fees, do you have any idea whether this is sort of on par with other fees?
I think the agency would probably
Okay,
be better
that's fine.
poised to answer that one.
Yep.
Okay. Other questions? Thank you very much. Director Bell? Welcome. Nice to see you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, and members of the committee. For the record, I am Rhonda Bell, the Executive Director of the Maryland Supplemental Retirement Plans. With me today is our Deputy Executive Director and Chief Financial Officer, Nakia Smith. We are very happy to come before you today to discuss our budget. We do extend our thanks to our analyst, Jacob Cash, for his thorough analysis, and we do appreciate the fact that he has concurred with the governor's budget allowance for MSRP. With that, we know we did submit written testimony that you should have before you, and we're happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Questions for the director? Wow.
Sorry.
Another surprising question.
Can you answer the question that I asked before, whether, well, two questions actually. One is how often do you put out a contract for plan administration? So how long is Nationwide's contract for? And how is their fee compared to others?
So we follow state procurement law, which requires us to procure a contract every 5 years. The Nationwide contract is currently expiring on August 14th, 2025. We have issued an RFP back in October, and we are in the process of wrapping up the evaluation of proposals. That contract is kind of standard for state procurement. There was an option that the board exercised, which extended Nationwide an additional year. So this is their 6th year that's ending. In terms of their fees, yes, I would say their fees are on par with the retirement industry for defined contribution plans, which are supplemental plans, which are different from the DB plans that the State Retirement Agency does. I will let you know that we have a contracted investment advisor that meets with the investment committee of the Board of Trustees on a quarterly basis. They review our investments, they review our fees, and they are always looking for the most efficient fee and the lowest fee for our plan participants. So we have active oversight, not only with the Board of Trustees and the investment committee, but also with our investment advisor, which is currently NFP, and our other investment advisor is T. Rowe Price.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions? All right, keep up the good work. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to take a 5-minute break and then have a very short voting session.